From Anderson Silva to Israel Adesanya, middleweight has played host to some of MMA's biggest stars and its most anticipated title fights. A far cry from the misfiring mess that the UFC first introduced in 2001. Today, we look at 185's turbulent early days, the botched title fights, the failed hype trains, and the generational star who lifted it from its rut. Welcome to the INC, and this is the story of the UFC middleweight division's dark age. The UFC's middleweight division can trace its origins to 1997. The introduction of the unified rules of MMA meant the UFC were forced to introduce weight classes, with primitive versions of welterweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight first brought into the fold. In 2001, the UFC's new owner Zuffa looked to expand its roster by introducing two further weight classes. After lightweight's introduction at UFC 30, plans were put in place to fill the gap between 170 and 205. The promotion gave the division the biggest possible pedestal. Using his connection in the Nevada State Athletic Commission, UFC owner Lorenzo Fertitta managed to get MMA legalized in the state, with the first middleweight title fight part of a stacked super show for the company's first event in Las Vegas. The two men chosen for the bout represented both sides of the MMA spectrum. Gil Castillo was an amateur wrestling standout and a student of Cesar Gracie, but was largely unproven against the sport's elites at the time. Dave Menne, meanwhile, made his name as a grizzled veteran on Wisconsin's regional scene, including wins over Dennis Hallman, Chris Lytle, and Carlos Newton. He also entered the bout with 5 times as many fights as his undersized opponent. Experience would ultimately triumph over potential. Menne used strong leg kicks and skillful reversals to neutralize Castillo's takedown attempts, and nearly caught the grappler in several guillotine attempts. Menne went on to claim a unanimous decision and provide an encouraging start for the UFC's new division. Menne's achievement would be overshadowed by the rest of the card, albeit not for the right reasons. UFC 33 is widely regarded as one of the company's worst ever shows, with every fight going to a decision and some providers missing the main event due to the extended running time. The fallout led the UFC to stop putting 3 title fights on its pay-per-views, a restriction that wouldn't be lifted until its first MSG card in 2016. Menne's first defense came against another of the card's survivors. Murilo Bustamante entered the UFC off a gold medal at the World Jiu-Jitsu Championships, and after falling to Chuck Liddell at the infamous card, returned to middleweight to face Menne at UFC 35. After controlling the opening rounds with his wrestling, Bustamante got it down with his hands in the second, catching Menne with a right hook and ending the Minnesota fighter's reign at the first hurdle. While the UFC was happy its investment in Bustamante paid off, his title win opened a can of worms. The Menne bout was the third of Bustamante's 4-fight contract, and with Pride FC waiting in the wings, the Brazilian wasn't exactly gung-ho on securing his long-term future. In 2002, Bustamante turned down a contract extension with the UFC, instead gambling on winning his title match with Matt Lindland and securing a better deal with the promotion. Bustamante later suggested that the UFC chose Lindland specifically as his opponent as they saw him as the best threat to dethrone the champion, a similar setup that befell Francis Ngannou during his own contract dispute 20 years later. Bustamante's bout with Lindland took place on the main event of UFC 37. During an early grappling exchange, Bustamante caught Lindland in an armbar with the Olympian appearing to tap, only for Big John McCarthy to second-guess himself and force the fight to continue, with Bustamante later suggesting he considered walking out of the cage in protest. The Brazilian, however, maintained his composure and submitted Lindland in the third round, thus technically becoming the only man to win the same UFC title fight twice. Bustamante returned to the contract table shortly after, but much to his chagrin, found the deal offered by the UFC was even less than before the Lindland fight. Bustamante's decision was all but made for him. The middleweight title was vacated a few months later, and Bustamante signed with Pride in 2003. It would be another 2 years before the UFC crowned Bustamante's successor. While middleweight bouts appeared regularly on UFC fight cards, the lack of a title left the division an aimless mix of veterans and flawed prospects. One of the most infamous was Phil Baroni. The New York Badass announced himself with an 18-second knockout of Dave Menne before facing division newcomer Evan Tanner at UFC 45. The match was mired in controversy, as Baroni attacked referee Larry Landless after accusing the official of stopping the bout prematurely. The fallout led to a rematch 7 months later, with Tanner ending the rivalry by unanimous decision. Baroni ended his career with a 17-19 record and is currently serving prison time after murdering his girlfriend in 2023. Tanner, meanwhile, claimed another win over Robbie Lawler at UFC 50, by which point the UFC were ready to bring the middleweight belt back into the fold. Tanner was chosen as one of the men to compete for the revived strap, but it was soon clear the decision wasn't made with the former 205er in mind. From the moment he entered a combat sports gym for the first time, David Terrell was earmarked for greatness. The 27-year-old was one of America's most exciting jiu-jitsu practitioners of the early 2000s, a bronze medalist at the ADCC Championships, and surpassing teammate Gil Castillo in becoming Cesar Gracie's first black belt. After 4 straight stoppage wins, Terrell made his UFC debut against Matt Lindland at UFC 49, and took just 24 seconds to beat the Olympic medalist. With good looks, an exciting style, and a striking level to match his grappling, Terrell was seen as the perfect face of middleweight 2.0, and his bout with Tanner at UFC 51 was seen on paper as a foregone conclusion. Terrell started the fight aggressively before nearly catching Tanner with an arm-in guillotine, only for Tanner to survive the hold and land several minutes of ground and pound. The once dominant Terrell looked lost against his much more experienced opponent, and Herb Dean's stoppage was an inevitable and much-needed climax.
It's all over! He stopped it! Oh my goodness! Is the middleweight champion of the world!
While the UFC's coronation of Terrell had failed, fans were unanimous in their support for Tanner, a grizzled veteran finally getting his moment after years of setbacks and adversity. His time on top, however, would be short-lived. Just 4 months after his win, Tanner took on old rival Rich Franklin in the co-main of UFC 53. While Tanner scored an early knockdown, he was soon pieced apart by Franklin's superior striking, forcing UFC officials to stop the fight midway through the 4th round. In the short term, it was former schoolteacher Franklin who'd oversee 185's chaotic classroom. Middleweight gained some much-needed reinforcements through the UFC's reality show, The Ultimate Fighter, with middleweight one of the divisions showcased during the show's first season. Chris Lieben, Kenny Florian, and Diego Sanchez were some of the notable names to compete at middleweight during their time with the promotion. In the short term, however, they'd all play second fiddle to another of the season's alumni. Nate Quarry had quickly emerged as one of Tough One's breakout characters. A fan favorite whose affable personality saw him considered a role model to his fellow fighters before being forced to withdraw from the show after suffering a knee injury in training. Quarry was signed to the UFC shortly after and made up for lost time with knockout wins over Shoney Carter and Pete Sell. This earned Quarry a title match with Franklin at UFC 56, becoming the first Tough alumni to achieve such an honor. While Quarry's booking brought extra eyeballs to the event, many feared that The Rock lacked the experience to pose a serious threat to the champion. They were proven right, as Franklin pieced Quarry apart during the fight's early stages before finishing with one of the greatest knockouts in UFC history.
Again, on the button, out,
and down goes Quarry.
Cold. Wow.
A first-round knockout is how Rich Franklin retains his belt.
Franklin would undergo further gimmickry for his next title defense. UFC 58 had been built around a US versus Canada theme, with all the bouts on the card seeing American athletes take on their Canadian counterparts. Flying the flag against Franklin would be David Loiseau, a Taekwondo black belt who served as a middleweight champion for the Canadian promotion TKO, and proved his UFC title credentials with wins over Mark Weir and Evan Tanner. While Loiseau had the skills on paper to pose a serious threat to Franklin, reality told a different story. Franklin dominated the fight from the start, dropping Loiseau twice in the first 2 rounds before several minutes of ground and pound through the remaining stanzas. Franklin's win broke the record for the biggest striking differential in a UFC main event, one which wouldn't be broken for 15 years. Loiseau never won another UFC fight, and retired in 2014 with 23 wins and 11 losses. While lacking the razzmatazz of his fellow champions, Franklin was emerging as an imposing force at 185. A blue-collar workhorse with a mix of striking and grappling prowess, and a tough puzzle to break for anyone outside of the sport's elite. It would take someone special to pry the belt away from Franklin. Unfortunately for the ace, the UFC had just signed such a man. In April of 2006, the UFC announced the signing of Muay Thai ace Anderson the Spider Silva. Silva had built his reputation through his runs with Pride and Cage Rage, showing a level of striking well above his peers, backed by a crescendo of highlight reel knockouts. Silva took just 49 seconds to knock out Chris Lieben in his company debut, and fans immediately discussed the prospect of Franklin defending his belt against the Spider. Franklin and Silva's bout eventually took place in the main event of UFC 64. Silva used his superior clinch work to hammer knees to Franklin's abdomen before breaking his nose in one of his rare ventures up top. The culmination of strikes proved too much for Franklin, as Silva claimed a first-round stoppage, and with it ended the middleweight dark age.
And it's over! Anderson Silva is the new middleweight champion!
Silva's dominance left many predicting he'd be the sport's next big champion, but few predicted the 7-year stranglehold the fighter held over the weight class. Between 2006 and 2013, Silva broke nearly every record the division had to offer, the most wins and title defenses in division history, as well as the company's longest winning streak, a record that still stands at the time of recording. Silva's reign also saw middleweight gain an influx of fresh talent. Dan Henderson, Luke Rockhold, and Jacare Souza arrived from Pride and Strikeforce, while Chael Sonnen and Michael Bisping came of age after moving to the class from 205. While Silva's reign ended at the hands of Chris Weidman, middleweight continued as one of the UFC's marquee divisions, peaking at UFC 243 when Robert Whittaker took on Israel Adesanya in front of the biggest crowd in UFC history. While several new weight classes often struggle in their early years, middleweight stands out due to its self-infliction. Its early introduction came without the talent pool to warrant it, while Bustamante's contract dispute created a drama which took several years to overcome. Franklin and Silva's reigns helped give middleweight the credibility it had long needed. Let's hope the current breed follow in their footsteps with a high-level, scandal-free future. Although, given the names on top right now, I remain doubtful.
No man that beats off the cartoons is gonna beat me.
Bro, trust me. I can tell you what.
This is the INC. Please like, share, and subscribe. Post your feedback in the comments and donate to our Patreon page for exclusive content.